The name was carved so deep into the old cedar fence post that Timothy Langston felt the grooves with his fingertips before he even raised the lantern to see it properly. Belle Wallace. 2 words, cut into the wood with something sharp, something desperate, like whoever had done it needed the world to remember that name even if they themselves could not survive to speak it aloud. Timothy did not know a Belle Wallace. He had only arrived in Redemption Creek, Texas, 3 days prior, dusty and road-worn, and carrying nothing but a saddlebag, a Winchester rifle, and a deed to 40 acres that his uncle had left him when he died of fever in the spring of 1882. He had not come looking for trouble. He had not come looking for anyone. He had come because the land was his, and because there was nowhere else on God's earth that held any particular claim on him. But that name. He crouched in the thin October dark, the lantern casting orange light across the fence line that separated what was technically now his property from the vast, wild stretch of Calhoun land to the west. The Calhouns, he had already been warned in town, were not people to cross. Amos Calhoun ran 300 head of cattle, owned the general store, controlled the water rights on the eastern fork of the creek, and had enough money and hired guns to make a man disappear between one sunrise and the next. The sheriff, a dull-eyed man named Pickett, collected a salary that Amos Calhoun funded personally. Timothy stood up slowly, still staring at the carving. Belle Wallace. The letters were not fresh. The wood had weathered around them, the grooves darkened with age and dirt, but not so old that the post had rotted through. A year maybe, maybe 2. He should have gone inside, should have banked the fire and slept. He had fencing to repair, and a well to dig, and 100 practical matters demanding his attention come morning. Instead, he stood there in the cold Texas night, holding his lantern up to a name carved into cedar, feeling the distinct and completely irrational sensation that something enormous had just begun. He did not know then what he was walking into. He did not know about the hidden motive behind his uncle's death, or about the dark past that had driven a woman to scratch her name into a fence post like a prisoner marking a cell wall. He did not know about the secrets Redemption Creek had been keeping for years, buried under politeness and church attendance, and the daily commerce of a frontier town that had decided, collectively, to look away from the wrong that lived at its center. He would learn all of it. Every terrible, beautiful, devastating piece of it. But first he would learn her name, and her name alone would change everything. Timothy Langston had come to Redemption Creek 3 days earlier on a Tuesday in early October of 1882, riding a roan mare named Clara who had carried him from San Antonio through Limestone Hill country and Mesquite flatlands without complaint. The deed to the 40 acres had arrived in a letter from his uncle's attorney 6 weeks before, along with a brief note explaining that his uncle, Harold Langston, had died of typhoid fever in August and had left the land to his only living nephew with the instruction that Timothy either work it or sell it, but under no circumstances let it sit idle and be absorbed by the Calhoun operation. That last part had struck Timothy as odd. He had read it twice. Under no circumstances let it sit idle and be absorbed by the Calhoun operation. Most people, in the final days of a fever, were not particularly concerned with land acquisition disputes. Harold Langston had apparently been the exception. Timothy had not known Harold well. The man was his father's older brother, a rancher and occasional surveyor who had moved west from Tennessee when Timothy was still a child. They had exchanged letters twice a year, and Timothy had visited once, the summer he turned 17, which would have made Harold about 50 at the time. Harold had been lean and sun-darkened, and had a habit of going silent for long stretches, not because he had nothing to say, but because he was listening to something in the distance that Timothy could not hear. Now Harold was dead and Timothy was 26 years old, and in possession of 40 acres in a county he barely knew, riding toward a small town whose name, Redemption Creek, struck him as either deeply hopeful or deeply ironic, depending on your experience of such places. The town itself was modest but not small. It had a main street of packed earth, 2 saloons, a livery stable, a dry goods store, a church with a bell tower, a school that doubled as a meeting hall, a telegraph office, and a number of houses and small businesses arrayed along cross streets that petered out into open land. The cattle trade ran through it seasonally, and the railroad had put a spur station 6 miles south 3 years back, which had brought in enough commerce to keep the town from dying, but not enough to make it genuinely prosperous. Timothy had ridden in on that Tuesday and immediately felt the quality of the silence that settled over the main street as he passed. Not the silence of an empty town, the silence of a town that was watching. Heads turned fractionally, and then returned to their business with the deliberate casualness of people who have decided they did not see what they saw. He had put Clara up at the livery, checked into the small hotel, eaten a meal at the boarding house next door where a round-faced woman named Mrs. Halloran served decent beef stew without being particularly friendly, and then spent the better part of that first evening asking careful questions about his uncle's property and the state of things generally. What he got back was a great deal of nothing dressed up as information. The land was good land, people allowed. Water access was complicated, people allowed. Harold Langston had been a respected man, people allowed. There were opportunities for a young rancher with ambition, people allowed. Nobody said a word about the cowhounds that wasn't either a compliment or a careful nothing. On the second day he had ridden out to the property itself and found it in better condition than he had feared. The cabin was small but solid, built of limestone blocks with a wood-shingled roof that needed attention in 2 places but would hold through winter if he was diligent. There was a barn, half full of old hay, with stalls for 4 animals. The well was good. The land itself rolled gently, a mix of grassland and scrub, with a thin line of pecan trees following a seasonal creek along the northern edge. It was honest land. The kind of land a person could make something real on if they worked hard and kept their head down. He had spent that second day walking it, measuring it in his mind, working out what it would take to run a small cattle operation or maybe some combination of cattle and crops. He had been a ranch hand since he was 15, had worked 3 different spreads across Texas and once briefly in New Mexico, and he understood land the way he understood horses, by feel and by patience. On the 3rd day he had ridden into town for supplies and had spent the afternoon at the dry goods store buying flour, salt, coffee, lamp oil, nails, and a length of wire for fence repairs. The man behind the counter was named Dobbins, a thin, nervous man who talked too fast and whose eyes moved constantly toward the door as if expecting someone. Timothy had asked him, casually, if he knew anything about the previous owner's reasons for leaving the property to a nephew rather than selling it. Dobbins had gone very still for a moment. Then he had said, too quickly, that he couldn't say, that Harold Langston had been a private man who kept his own counsel, and had he heard that the cowhound operation was always looking for good working hands if the 40 acres proved too hard a go for a single man. Timothy had thanked him and taken his supplies and ridden back to the property with the very clear sense that something in Redemption Creek was badly wrong in a way that nobody was willing to name out loud. That night he had walked the fence line with his lantern, checking the condition of the posts, cataloging what needed replacement, and that was when he found it. The old cedar post at the southwest corner of the property, where his land met the Calhoun Range, and the name carved into it, Belle Wallace. He stood there for a long time in the October cold, long enough for the coyotes to start up in the distance, and for the stars to wheel a noticeable degree westward overhead. Then he went inside, banked the fire, lay down on the narrow cot in the corner of the main room, and stared at the ceiling. He did not sleep particularly well. In the morning he rode into town again with the specific intention of finding out who Belle Wallace was. He was subtle about it. He had learned early in life that the fastest way to get information in a small community was almost never to ask for it directly. He asked Mrs. Halloran if there were many families in the area he ought to know as a new landholder, neighbors and such. Mrs. Halloran listed several names and families with the comfortable authority of a woman who considered herself the unofficial register of local society. She mentioned the Petersons to the north, the Garner family east of town, old widow Macready who had a kitchen garden and would trade eggs for help with heavy work. She mentioned a few others. She did not mention any Wallaces. Timothy thanked her and tried the feed store next, where an older man named Crutchfield was more talkative, particularly after Timothy bought a substantial quantity of oats and engaged him on the subject of local water rights, which turned out to be a topic the man had strong opinions about. In the course of that conversation, Timothy learned that Amos Calhoun had, over the course of about 5 years, systematically acquired or legally maneuvered his way into control of most of the significant water access on the eastern side of the county, which had made things very difficult for several smaller operations. Some of those operations, Crutchfield said, dropping his voice though there was nobody else in the store, had been bought out under what you might call pressure. Some had simply failed. One or two had seen their owners leave the county suddenly and without much explanation. Timothy asked if he remembered anyone named Wallace in the area. Crutchfield went quiet in the way Timothy was starting to recognize as the particular local silence, the one that meant the person knew something and was calculating the cost of sharing it. Then Crutchfield said very quietly that there had been a Wallace family, farther out, north of the Langston property up near the limestone breaks. Father named James Wallace, widower, and a daughter. They had run a small operation, about 30 head, nothing impressive but honest work. James Wallace had not sold willingly. There had been some dispute about water rights, and then there had been a fire. And after the fire, James Wallace had taken sick and died, and the daughter had been left alone. Timothy waited. Crutchfield picked up a piece of tack that did not need inspection and inspected it. He said the girl had nowhere to go, no family, and that Amos Calhoun had what you might call taken an interest in helping her get settled. She was working in the Calhoun house now, helping with domestic arrangements. Timothy kept his face very carefully neutral. He said he appreciated the information, settled his bill, loaded his oats, and rode back to his property with a cold, settled weight sitting in his chest that had nothing to do with the October wind. Belle Wallace was not just a name on a fence post. She was a real woman, a woman who had lost her father and her land, and was now living under the roof of the man who had, as far as Timothy could piece together, been responsible for both losses. And somebody, at some point, had felt the need to carve her name into a fence post on the boundary of the neighboring land. He wondered if it had been Harold. The thought stopped him so completely that Clara tossed her head and sidestepped, confused by the sudden tension in his hands on the reins. He steadied her automatically, but his mind was running forward fast. Harold Langston had not sold his land to the Calhouns. Harold Langston had died of fever, yes, but Harold had also been a man who paid attention to things, who listened to the distance, and who had written in his last will and testament a specific instruction about not letting the Calhoun operation absorb the property. Harold had known about Belle Wallace. Harold had perhaps known her, had perhaps been trying, in whatever way a solitary bachelor rancher on 40 acres could manage, to protect her. And Harold was dead. Timothy rode the rest of the way home in silence, thinking about traps and dark pasts, and what it meant that he was now standing in the place Harold had occupied. He saw her for the first time 4 days after finding her name on the post. He had ridden into town for the Sunday service, not because he was particularly devout, but because he was new, and a new man who didn't appear at church quickly became a new man people were suspicious of, and he was trying to avoid additional complications. The church was a straightforward whitewashed building with pews that smelled of linseed oil and a preacher named Holloway who had a good voice and a tendency toward the Old Testament. Timothy was in the third pew from the back, hat on his knee, when she came in. She was perhaps 23, 24 years old, with dark brown hair pinned up under a modest hat that had seen better years. She was slender but not fragile-looking, with the kind of posture that comes from working hard and holding yourself together by will rather than comfort. Her face was composed, deliberately composed, the way a person looks when they have spent a long time practicing not showing what they feel. But her eyes, which were a particular shade of gray-brown that Timothy could not name with any single color, moved carefully over the congregation as she entered, cataloging exits and presences with a wariness that he recognized because he had seen it before, in horses that had been treated badly. She was accompanied by Amos Calhoun. Calhoun was in his mid-50s, broad-shouldered, with a thick gray mustache and the comfortable authority of a man who had never been told no by anyone in his immediate vicinity for a very long time. He walked in behind her with one hand at the small of her back, not touching exactly but present, possessive in the way of a man who considers the space around a woman to be territory he has already claimed. Timothy watched Belle Wallace take her seat in the front pew, Calhoun beside her, and watched her fold her hands in her lap with great precision, and he thought about the word carved into the fence post and about Harold, and about what kind of courage it took to carve your own name somewhere permanent when everything else about your life was being erased. He did not speak to her that Sunday. He was not foolish enough to create a scene in church with Amos Calhoun present and the dull-eyed sheriff picket 3 pews over. He watched, and he listened, and he noted that Belle Wallace did not sing the hymns, though everyone around her did, and that when Preacher Holloway spoke about the virtue of submission to earthly authority, she went very still in a way that was distinct from simply paying attention. He went home and spent the afternoon repairing his roof, driving nails with more force than strictly necessary. Over the following 2 weeks, he built a careful picture of Belle Wallace's situation through the kind of patient, fragmentary information gathering that left no single conversation as a clear marker of his interest. He confirmed from Crutchfield and from a blacksmith named Garrett, and from careful listening at the saloon on one evening that Belle had been in the Calhoun household for approximately 8 months, since shortly after her father's death in February of that year. She worked as a housekeeper and was paid a small wage that, from what he could determine, was more theoretical than practical since Amos Calhoun managed it directly as part of some arrangement involving debts incurred by her father's estate. The debts were the trap. Timothy understood that mechanism immediately. Manufacture a debt, or inflate a real one, and suddenly the person who owes it cannot leave without owing something they cannot pay. It was not an uncommon arrangement in the West. It was also not legal in any meaningful way that a bought sheriff was going to enforce. Belle Wallace was not a prisoner in any literal sense. She could walk out of the Calhoun house at any time. She simply had nowhere to go, no money, no land, no family, and a manufactured debt following her that Calhoun could use to make her life impossible in this county and possibly the next. What Timothy could not determine yet was what exactly Calhoun wanted from her in the long run. The man was a widower, his wife dead 6 years prior. He had 2 grown sons who worked the ranch. He was a man of status and acquisitive habit. Timothy's best and worst guess was that Calhoun intended eventually to make Belle Wallace his second wife, not out of any genuine feeling, but because she was young and available, and because acquiring her permanently would finalize the erasure of the Wallace family from any claim to the land or water rights that had been taken from them. It made Timothy feel physically ill. He began thinking about how to approach her. He needed to be careful because any direct approach risked Calhoun's attention, and Calhoun's attention meant the hired guns and the bought sheriff, and possibly a very unfortunate accident on a lonely road. He also needed to be careful because he did not know what Belle Wallace herself wanted, and whatever he did had to be shaped around her choices, and not just his own impulse to fix a situation that enraged him. The opportunity came at the end of October, not through any scheme he devised but through simple geography. His northern fence line ran close to the road that led from the Calhoun house into town, and on the morning of October the 28th, he was working that fence, replacing posts, when he heard hoofbeats and looked up to see a woman riding a gray horse at a conservative trot. She was alone, which surprised him, and she was carrying a basket over one arm that suggested she was headed to town on some errand. She did not see him until she was almost level with him, and when she did, she pulled the gray horse up short and they looked at each other across about 20 yards of open scrub. He took his hat off. She did not run, which he counted as a good sign. She looked at him with those careful gray-brown eyes and the composed expression, and he could see her reading him the way she had read the church on Sunday, assessing threat and exit simultaneously. He said good morning and told her his name, Timothy Langston, and that he was Harold Langston's nephew and had recently come into the property to the south. He said it simply, without anything attached to it. Something changed in her face very briefly when he said Harold's name. Something that was not quite grief and not quite recognition, but somewhere between the two. A flash of interior weather that came and went before he could name it fully. She said her name, Belle Wallace. Her voice was low and steady, and she said it like she intended it to be heard. Like saying it out loud to a stranger was something she did deliberately. He said he was pleased to make her acquaintance and asked if she was headed to town and whether the road was decent from here on, and they had a short, perfectly ordinary conversation about road conditions and the state of the weather that was entirely unremarkable and entirely not about any of the things that mattered. She rode on. He went back to his fence post. But when she passed the southwest corner of his property, he was watching from a distance, and he saw her slow the gray horse as she came level with the old cedar post. He saw her glance down at it. He saw her straighten and ride on without stopping, but the straightening itself was a kind of answer. She knew the name was there. Of course she knew. She had put it there herself. Over the weeks that followed, Timothy and Belle crossed paths in the way that two people in a small community inevitably do when they are both paying attention to the possibility. He began going to church every Sunday without exception. She was always there with Calhoun, always composed, always contained. But he started noticing small things that were meant to be noticed. On the second Sunday, she arrived wearing a different hat, a simpler one, and he thought perhaps that was her own preference rather than a chosen presentation. On the third Sunday, she sang one hymn, just one, and he thought her voice was the most honestly expressed thing he had heard from her. He manufactured reasons to be at the dry goods store on Tuesday mornings, which he determined was when she came in for household supplies. He was always there for perfectly legitimate reasons, buying legitimate things, and they exchanged perfectly legitimate pleasantries while Dobbins hovered nervously behind his counter. But on the fourth such Tuesday, she said, passing him on her way to examine the fabric bolts, very quietly and without looking at him, that she usually walked along the creek north of the pecan trees on Thursday afternoons. The household gave her an hour. He heard the thing behind that sentence very clearly. It was both an invitation and an indication of exactly how little freedom she actually had. He was at the creek on Thursday. She arrived on foot, without the gray horse, dressed practically in a dark skirt and a heavy coat against the November cold. The pecan trees had gone bare, and the creek was running low and clear over limestone, and they walked along it for about 40 minutes, having what was on the surface a conversation about the land and the county and the history of the area. Underneath that conversation was an entirely different one. She told him about her father, James Wallace, who had been a careful man and a decent rancher. She told him about the water dispute, which had been initiated by Calhoun 3 years ago using a legal argument about upstream rights that was questionable at best and fraudulent at worst, but that the county judge, who owed Calhoun a great deal in various ways, had ruled in Calhoun's favor. She told him about the dry summer that had followed, the cattle losses, the debt accumulation. She told him about the fire, which had taken the barn and all their winter feed stores, and which she said in a voice entirely devoid of inflection had started under circumstances that were never satisfactorily explained. Her father had never recovered from the loss. He had been a man who believed in working the land and working fair, and he found himself without the capacity to process what had been done to him through channels that were supposed to prevent such things. He had fallen ill in December and died in February. She told him all of this in the composed, controlled voice of someone who has already done most of their grieving in private and is now simply reporting facts. But when she talked about her father, she looked at the creek instead of at Timothy, and her hands, folded together in front of her, gripped each other hard. Timothy told her about Harold, about the instruction in the will, about the feeling he had gotten riding into Redemption Creek that the town's silence was an active thing, a collective agreement rather than mere ignorance. She said that Harold Langston had known her father, that they had been friendly neighbors, the way men on neighboring land are when they share certain values and certain practical problems. She said Harold had been one of the few people in the county who had spoken openly about the water rights situation, had even written a letter to the state land office on James Wallace's behalf, which had produced nothing except Calhoun's awareness that Harold was not going to be cooperative. She said Harold had died of fever. The way she said it was identical to the way he had said the fire's cause was never satisfactorily explained. Timothy felt something cold and clarifying settle into him. The word betrayal was too small for what had been done here, the systematic destruction of two families, the manufactured death of a man who stood in the way, the imprisonment of a young woman through debt and dependency. But betrayal was part of it. The betrayal of every legal and moral structure that was supposed to prevent exactly this. He asked her about her name on the fence post. She was quiet for a long moment, watching the creek. Then she said she had carved it the night before she moved into the Calhoun house, after she had buried her father and sold the last of her cattle to cover the funeral costs, and understood that she had no options that she could currently see. She had gone to the boundary fence, the one between what had been Wallace land and what had been Langston land, and she had carved her name into the post with her father's pocket knife. He asked why. She said it was so that someone would know she had existed here, that she had been here before, that her name belonged on this land even if the land had been taken from her. He thought that was one of the bravest things he had ever heard. He thought it quietly to himself and said only that he understood. They walked back separately, she first, and he after a sufficient interval, and he rode home through the late November afternoon with the certain knowledge that he was falling in love with Belle Wallace, which was both the most natural thing he had felt in years and also extremely complicated. He spent the following weeks thinking about what he could actually do. The emotional reality of what he felt was one thing. The practical reality of Belle's situation was another. He could not simply ask her to leave the Calhoun house and come live on his 40 acres. That would accomplish nothing except to hand Calhoun a justification for using the hired guns and the sheriff together, and Belle would be worse off than before. He needed to attack the actual mechanisms holding her there, which meant the debt and the legal arrangements around the Wallace land. He spent an afternoon at the telegraph office sending a message to a land rights attorney in San Antonio, whom a ranch hand he'd once worked with had recommended as an honest man. He framed his inquiry carefully, asking about the legality of water rights seizures in the relevant county, the process for contesting a probate debt arrangement when the deceased had no formal administrator, and whether a letter to the state land office had any traceable history. The attorney's response, which arrived 3 days later and cost him $3 in telegraph fees, confirmed several things he had suspected. The water rights ruling was on questionable legal ground and had not been properly recorded at the state level. A probate debt arrangement without formal court approval was not legally enforceable as a labor obligation. And there was indeed a letter in the state land office file from one Harold Langston, dated 14 months ago, flagging concerns about improper land and water acquisitions in the county, a letter that had been received and filed and not acted upon. He wrote back immediately requesting a formal consultation and asking about the process for contesting the water rights ruling. The attorney, whose name was Mr. Alan Reeves, replied that he would be willing to take the case on contingency if the evidence supported the contest. He would need to come to Redemption Creek to review original documents, which he proposed to do in December. Timothy wrote to confirm, and then sat with the letter in his hands for a moment, feeling the specific satisfaction of something beginning to move. In December, the pecan trees along the creek were entirely bare, and the morning frosts were lasting until midday. Timothy and Belle continued to meet on Thursday afternoons when the household permitted her the hour. The conversations had deepened past the careful factual exchange of early acquaintance into something more genuine, more reciprocal. She began telling him things that were not purely practical, and he did the same. She told him she had grown up with more freedom than most girls in the county, because her father had treated her less like a daughter to be protected and more like a partner in the ranch work. She had learned to ride before she learned to read, had helped with cattle from age 7 onward, knew how to mend a fence and pull a calf and read weather from the shape of clouds. She had a self-sufficiency that had not been broken by what Calhoun had done to her, only constrained, and the constraint was what she found genuinely unendurable. He told her he had never stayed anywhere long enough to build something. That the ranch work across different spreads had been good work, but essentially rootless. That he had not understood until he stood on Harold's 40 acres that he had been looking for a place without consciously admitting it. He told her that the land felt like a possibility he hadn't known he was hoping for. She asked him once, with the directness she was beginning to deploy more freely in his company, whether he intended to stay permanently or whether he was the kind of man who would get restless and sell. He told her he was not that kind of man. He had thought he might be once, but he wasn't. She nodded and looked at the creek, and he thought her shoulders had relaxed fractionally. He told her about Alan Reeves and the legal inquiry. He did it carefully, watching her face, because he was aware that hope could be a form of cruelty if it was raised, and then failed to materialize. He did not promise outcomes. He described the situation accurately and said that there appeared to be legitimate legal grounds for contesting several of the actions Calhoun had taken. The expression that crossed her face was not hope exactly. It was something more guarded than hope, the expression of a person who has learned to be very careful with hope, because they know its weight when it fails. But she listened, and she asked precise, intelligent questions about the legal mechanics, and she said that her father had kept records of the original water rights agreements, and that she believed those documents were still in a box in the root cellar of the original Wallace property, which Calhoun had taken over but not yet developed. That was significant. Timothy said so. Original documents challenging Calhoun's claimed rights would be exactly what Reeves would need. They discussed how to access the Wallace property without drawing attention. Belle said she was sometimes sent out to the old place to check on a small shed that Calhoun was using for equipment storage, that she could plausibly spend time there without it being remarkable. Timothy said he would meet her there on the following Thursday, and they would look for the documents together. The following Thursday, they found the box. It was exactly where Belle had said, in the root cellar under a section of warped flooring, wrapped in oilskin that had kept the contents reasonably dry. Inside were James Wallace's handwritten records, the original survey documents, 2 letters from neighboring landowners confirming the pre-dispute water access arrangements, and most significantly, a copy of a water rights agreement signed in 1874, 8 years before the dispute, that established the Wallace family's legal share of the creek access in entirely clear terms. Belle held the copy of the 1874 agreement in both hands and stood very still for a moment in the dim cellar light. Timothy could see the effort it was costing her to keep her composure. He said quietly, that her father had known what he was doing when he kept these. She said her father had always believed that truth left in writing was harder to destroy than truth held only in memory. He thought about that for a long time afterward. Alan Reeves arrived in Redemption Creek on the 15th of December, presenting himself as a land surveyor doing routine work in the county, which was technically true enough to pass casual scrutiny. Timothy met him at the hotel, and they spent 2 evenings going over the documents, with Reeves confirming that the 1874 agreement was genuine, properly witnessed and recorded at a county level, and represented solid grounds for contesting the water rights ruling. He also confirmed that the probate arrangement under which Belle's wages were being held was not court-approved, and therefore had no legal standing as an enforceable debt. Reeves was a careful man who knew exactly what kind of county he was in. He said the process would not be instantaneous. Filing with the state land court would take time. Calhoun would almost certainly respond with legal resistance and possibly other kinds of pressure. Timothy needed to be prepared for the possibility that things would get unpleasant before they resolved. Timothy said he understood and that he intended to be ready. What he had not anticipated was how quickly Calhoun would become aware that something was happening. Dobbins at the dry goods store, the thin, nervous man with the wandering eyes, had noticed Alan Reeves's visits to the hotel. He had noticed because that was his purpose. Timothy understood in retrospect, to notice newcomers and report to Calhoun. By the time Reeves left on the morning of the 17th, Calhoun already knew a San Antonio attorney had been in town. The consequences arrived on the 19th of December, a cold, clear morning when Timothy rode into town and found 2 of Calhoun's hired men waiting outside the telegraph office. They did not threaten him directly. In fact, they were perfectly polite, which was its own kind of message. One of them, a tall man named Cord who had the unhurried manner of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous person in a room, simply mentioned that Mr. Calhoun had heard Timothy was settling in nicely, and that Mr. Calhoun was always interested in meeting the county's newer landholders, and would Timothy consider calling on the Calhoun house at his earliest convenience. Timothy said he would be happy to pay his respects. He rode out to the Calhoun property the following afternoon with his Winchester cleaned and loaded, though he left it in the scabbard on Clara's saddle when he tied her at the post. The Calhoun house was substantial for the area, 2 stories, with a covered porch and glass windows, and the general appearance of a man who wanted people to understand his prosperity every time they looked at it. Amos Calhoun received him in what he called the parlor, a room furnished with pieces that had been hauled in from somewhere much farther east. He was gracious and hospitable in the manner of a man who is allowing you to exist in his space as a temporary courtesy. He offered coffee and Timothy accepted it. They talked about land and cattle and the county's future prospects for about 20 minutes. Calhoun was a skilled conversationalist. Timothy gave him that. He managed to say nothing concrete while making it entirely clear that he considered himself the central fact of the local landscape, and that other people's decisions and prosperity were, in a direct sense, downstream of his own. Then Calhoun said, almost casually, that he understood Timothy had been consulting with an attorney about some land matters, and that he hoped everything was in order with the property, and that if Timothy had any questions or concerns about local arrangements, he himself was always willing to be helpful. He said the county worked best when people understood how things functioned and didn't waste time on approaches that were unlikely to produce results. Timothy said he appreciated the guidance and that he was simply doing due diligence on his uncle's estate, standard legal practice. Calhoun smiled and said that made complete sense and that Harold had been a fine neighbor, if occasionally a little stubborn about things that were not worth being stubborn about. He said it with the comfortable authority of a man saying something true that he has no reason to hide. Timothy kept his face neutral. He finished his coffee and took his leave. On the ride home, he processed what had just happened. The conversation had been a warning delivered with extraordinary courtesy. Calhoun knew about the attorney. Calhoun was making clear that he was aware, that he was watching, and that he considered the situation manageable. He had not threatened Belle specifically or made any reference to her, which either meant he didn't yet know that Belle was connected to the inquiry, or it meant he was keeping her as an unspoken leverage point, a thing he held that Timothy would not want to see damaged. Timothy thought it was probably both. He needed to move faster than he had planned. He sent a letter to Reeves that night by way of the early mail coach, laying out what had happened and asking him to expedite the state filing as much as legally possible, and also asking a specific additional question about the possibility of contesting the validity of the probate debt through a different mechanism, one that did not require waiting for the water rights case to resolve first. Then he spent Christmas Eve alone on his property, mending tack by lamplight and thinking about everything. He had not told Belle about the Calhoun meeting. He would tell her Thursday. Thursday arrived bright and extremely cold, the kind of cold that came down off the northern plains and turned Texas limestone blue-white. Belle met him at the creek, and she was pale, paler than usual, and she told him before he could say anything that Calhoun had been different this week, watchful in a way he hadn't been before. He had asked her twice about the old Wallace property, specifically about whether anything had been moved or disturbed there. She had said no, naturally, and with the composure she had perfected over 8 months of necessary performance, but she was concerned he was becoming suspicious. Timothy told her about the Calhoun meeting. He was honest and complete about it. He watched her process the information with that particular analytical steadiness that he had come to deeply admire, the way she separated what was known from what was feared and refused to add the two together prematurely. She said that if Calhoun became certain that she was involved in any legal challenge, the situation in the house would become untenable before the legal process could resolve it. She said this matter-of-factly, but he heard exactly what she meant. Untenable was not a word that covered only inconvenience. Timothy had been thinking about this. He had thought about it quite a lot in the cold hours of the previous nights. He had a solution, and it was a simple one, and he was genuinely uncertain how she would receive it. He said there was one way to change her situation immediately, legally and completely, that did not depend on the timeline of the state court case. He said it would require her to make a significant decision based on a relatively short acquaintance, and that he understood if she found it presumptuous or premature. Belle looked at him with the careful gray-brown eyes. He said that if she were to agree to marry him, she would leave the Calhoun household as his wife, with no debt obligation transferable to a married woman's separate legal status, and with the legal protection of a husband's name and property while the state case proceeded. He said he was aware that was an enormously unusual proposal, and that he was not making it casually, that he meant every word of it and was not suggesting merely a legal arrangement, but that he also fully understood if she needed to say no. There was a silence that lasted for what felt to Timothy like a very considerable portion of his life. Then Belle said that she needed to think about it. Not because she found the proposal unwelcome, she said, and her voice had shifted in a way that told him something important, but because she refused to make a decision of this magnitude from fear rather than genuine choosing. She said she had spent 8 months having her choices made for her, and she would not enter into the most significant agreement of her life in the same way. He said that was exactly the right answer, and that he would wait as long as she needed. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said she would have an answer by the following Thursday. He rode home feeling something that was entirely outside his prior experience, a compound of hope and patience, and the kind of terrified wanting that he had previously associated only with high-stakes card games, and that seemed deeply insufficient as a comparison. He did not see Belle on Sunday at church. She was absent from the front pew, and Calhoun sat with a rigid stillness that told Timothy something had shifted. He rode home carefully, watching the road. On Monday morning, a small folded note was wedged into a crack in the wood of the old cedar fence post, tucked directly below where Belle's name was carved. He found it on his morning walk of the fence line, which he now conducted every day. The note said, in a small, precise hand, that something had happened, that Calhoun had told her directly that he intended to formalize their arrangement at the new year, which she understood to mean he was going to present her with a marriage proposal she would not be in a position to refuse, and that she had made her decision. The note said, yes. He held that small piece of paper in the January wind and felt something enormous shift inside him. He was in town at the telegraph office within 2 hours, sending a wire to Reeves explaining the acceleration of the timeline and asking what was required to file for a marriage license in the county and whether there were any legal obstacles given Belle's current probate situation. Reeves wired back within the day confirming that a probate debt arrangement without court approval could not legally prevent a woman from marrying, and that the marriage license required only a standard waiting period of 3 days once filed, and that he would, if Timothy thought it useful, make himself available to be present for the process. Timothy filed the license that same afternoon. He went directly from the courthouse to the old fence post and left his own note in the same crack where he had found hers. It said, 3 days. He signed his name. What happened next was the part he had not fully planned for, which was that Calhoun found out about the marriage license before the 3 days were up. In retrospect, he supposed he should have anticipated it. Calhoun had his informants everywhere, and the courthouse clerk was not immune to the same pressures that governed the rest of the town. Calhoun learned about the license filing within hours, and his response was immediate and not subtle. On the second morning after the filing, Timothy arrived at his barn to find that someone had cut his fence line in 2 places during the night, and that 3 of the 4 horses he had acquired since arriving were gone. Clara was still there. She had been in the barn, but the others were gone, and the tracks in the frost led toward the Calhoun range. He saddled Clara and rode directly to the Calhoun house. He found Cord and another hired man at the gate. He told them calmly that he was there to speak with Amos Calhoun, and that he was aware this conversation was going to be less pleasant than the last one, and that he intended to have it nonetheless. He was let through, which told him Calhoun wanted this confrontation on his own ground, which was fine. Timothy had thought about it on the ride over. Calhoun met him in the yard, not in the parlor this time. No coffee, no pretense. He said plainly that he was aware of the license filing and that he considered it an unfriendly act given that Timothy's involvement with Belle Wallace's legal affairs was not something he had authorized. Timothy said he wasn't aware he needed Calhoun's authorization for anything. Calhoun said that men who failed to understand how things worked in this county tended to find life considerably more difficult. He said it in the same comfortable tone he had used in the parlor, which was its own kind of threat because of its certainty. Timothy said he had sent all of the relevant documents regarding the 1874 water rights agreement and the probate debt arrangement to his attorney in San Antonio, with copies to the state land office and to a newspaper editor in San Antonio he had contacted before leaving the city, and that those communications were already sent regardless of anything that happened here, because he had sent them 10 days ago. The comfortable certainty in Calhoun's face shifted by approximately 1 millimeter. Timothy said he also had a letter from his uncle Harold, which he had found among the property papers, dated 6 months before Harold's death, addressed to a circuit judge in Austin describing in considerable detail the water rights dispute and the circumstances of the Wallace family's difficulties. He did not have such a letter. He was gambling entirely. But Harold had been a careful man who paid attention to things, and it was not an unreasonable gamble. He said that the 3 horses cut out of his herd last night needed to come back. He said he would be collecting his bride on Saturday morning regardless of any other considerations. And he said that if anything happened to Belle Wallace between now and Saturday, The package of communications he had arranged to go to 4 separate parties would go immediately. This last was also a gamble because the communication arrangement he was describing was not quite as robust as he implied. But the important thing was that Calhoun could not be certain it wasn't. There was a long silence during which Timothy was very aware of the exact position of Cord and the other hired man behind him and the distance from where he stood to the gate. Then Calhoun said something would be arranged about the horses. He said it quietly and without the comfortable authority, and Timothy heard in that quiet the first sound of a man recalculating. He rode home at a walk, not letting himself push Clara into anything that looked like flight, and when he was out of sight of the Calhoun house, he exhaled for what felt like the first time in 30 minutes. The horses were returned to his fence line by noon. There was no note with them. He put them back in the paddock and went inside and spent a very long time sitting at the table drinking coffee and staring at the wall. Saturday morning arrived clear and cold, with a hard frost on everything, and the sun coming up orange over the limestone hills. Timothy dressed carefully in his best clothes, which were not particularly fine but were clean and pressed, and he had bought a new collar the previous week, without letting himself examine too closely why. He saddled Clara and rode to the Calhoun house at 9 in the morning. He had sent word to Preacher Holloway the previous Thursday, and Holloway, who was a man of actual principle beneath his Old Testament preferences, had said he would be willing to conduct the ceremony and to travel for it if necessary. Timothy had arranged for him to wait at the property with Mrs. Halloran, who had turned out, once actually confronted with the specifics of the situation, to have reserves of decisive righteousness that her carefully neutral boarding-house manner had entirely concealed. When he arrived at the Calhoun house, Belle was waiting on the porch. She was dressed in a dark blue dress he had not seen before, and she was carrying a small bag. She had apparently already told Calhoun she was leaving, because when Timothy arrived, Calhoun was standing in the doorway behind her, and the expression on his face was one Timothy filed away as the face of a man who has made a calculation and does not like the result but is accepting it for now. Calhoun said nothing. Belle walked down the porch steps and Timothy held out his hand and she took it, and he helped her up onto his spare horse, the roan gelding he had acquired after arrival, and they rode away from the Calhoun house side by side. She did not look back. He did not either, but he kept his attention on the sounds behind them until the Calhoun property was well out of range. They were married that morning at the cabin, with Preacher Holloway and Mrs. Halloran, and Crutchfield from the feed store, who had shown up without invitation and stood in the corner with his hat in his hands and tears on his face that he was pretending were not there. The ceremony was brief and the words were simple, and when Preacher Holloway pronounced them married, Timothy looked at Belle and found she was already looking at him, and the composure she had worn for 8 months had shifted, not into anything fragile but into something different, something that had stopped working quite so hard. He thought she was the most remarkable person he had met in his life. Mrs. Halloran had brought a cake, which was extraordinary given the short notice, and they ate it at the table in the cabin, and Crutchfield told a long and not entirely accurate story about a water rights dispute he'd witnessed in another county 20 years prior that had been resolved by someone throwing a judge's desk through a window, which made Belle laugh, a genuine laugh, uncontrolled and surprised and luminous. And Timothy thought he would spend the rest of his life trying to hear that sound as frequently as possible. The legal proceedings moved forward over the following months with the steady, grinding pace of formal processes. Allen Reeves was as good as his word. He filed the water rights contest in January of 1883 with the state land court in Austin, supported by the 1874 agreement, and the supplementary documents Belle had recovered from the root cellar. He also filed a formal objection to the probate debt arrangement on the grounds that it had never been court-approved, which was resolved relatively quickly in February, when the state judge reviewing it declared it unenforceable. That resolution meant that Belle owed Calhoun nothing. Not a cent. The debt had never been legal. When that ruling came through, Timothy read it to her aloud at the table after supper, and she sat for a moment with her hands folded very precisely in her lap the way she had in that church pew on his first Sunday. And then she put her face in her hands briefly, and he moved around the table and put his arm around her, and she let herself be held, which he understood was not something she did easily or often. The water rights case took longer, as Reeves had predicted. Calhoun retained his own attorneys and filed counterarguments, and the process ground through the winter and into spring with the periodic sending and receiving of documents and the occasional requirement for Reeves to travel to Austin. During this period, Calhoun was present in their lives as a constant background tension, not actively hostile in any demonstrable way that could be pointed at, but a presence, a weight. Sheriff Pickett stopped Timothy twice on minor pretexts, once about the horses, once about some vague concern about property boundaries, both times amounting to nothing. Cord and the other hired men were visible at a distance more often than was natural. Timothy and Belle dealt with it by working. There was a great deal of work to do. The 40 acres needed genuine development to support them, and they threw themselves into it with the combined energy of two people who are finally living in a situation they have chosen rather than endured. Belle turned out to be, as she had described, entirely competent with ranch work. She could diagnose a sick animal, repair a fence, and manage a kitchen garden with equal facility, and she had opinions about cattle breeds and water management that were both informed and practically sound. He had not expected to find in a wife someone who was also a genuine working partner in the most concrete sense, though he recognized in retrospect that he should not have been surprised given what he knew of her. They developed a rhythm together that was deeply satisfying, the kind of daily collaboration that builds something real between two people not just through the large moments, but through the accumulated weight of small shared decisions and small shared jokes, and the particular comfort of working alongside someone you respect. They had separate sleeping arrangements for the first 2 months, not because either of them demanded it, but because Timothy had been careful to tell her that he intended to give her whatever time and space she needed to simply be a person in her own home without pressure or expectation. And she had looked at him with those gray-brown eyes, and said that was the first time in almost a year that anyone had offered her a choice without a condition attached. One evening in late March she came and sat beside him by the fire, and they talked for a long time about things that were entirely unrelated to legal proceedings or ranch work, just their actual selves, where they had come from and what they had thought about and what they were afraid of. She told him she was afraid she had been made less by the year with Calhoun, that she could feel places in herself where she used to be confident and wasn't anymore, and that she was learning to find them again, but it was slow. He told her he was afraid of exactly the kind of rootlessness that leaving had always represented for him, that staying was something he had to choose actively every day because it didn't come naturally yet. She said staying was something she was finding easier on this particular 40 acres with this particular person than she had expected when she first made her decision. He took her hand. She looked at their hands together for a moment. She said she thought she was ready to stop the separate sleeping arrangements. He said he thought that was a very good idea. The water rights ruling came down in June of 1883. The state land court ruled in favor of the Wallace estate's original claim, voiding Calhoun's 2-year-old ruling on the grounds of documentation fraud and improper recording. This meant that the creek access reverted to its pre-dispute allocation, and several other operations in the county that had been affected by Calhoun's water consolidation also had their rights restored. It was not the end of Calhoun. The man was too large an operation, and too well embedded for one court ruling to dismantle entirely. He retained his cattle spread and his general store and his political connections. though those connections were somewhat degraded by the ruling and the newspaper coverage that followed in San Antonio and eventually in 2 other Texas papers. Sheriff Pickett was quietly replaced by an elected successor the following year. The county judge who had issued the original water rights ruling resigned from office in the autumn, citing health reasons, though the health in question appeared to be the political variety. Calhoun himself never directly confronted Timothy or Belle again after the ruling. He was a man who understood power, and he understood when a particular contest had been lost. He did not forgive, and he did not forget, and he remained a presence in the county, but he was no longer the unchecked force he had been. The letter to the Austin Circuit judge had, Timothy learned much later, actually existed, tucked in a different folder of Harold's papers that he hadn't gone through until the spring. Harold had written it 10 months before his death and had never sent it, but Reeves had found it useful as supplementary evidence in the proceedings. Harold had known. He had been building a case, even as the fever took hold of him. On a warm evening in July, Timothy stood at the southwest corner of his property and looked at the old cedar fence post and the name carved into it. Belle came and stood beside him. He had told her early on that he had found the name there before he had ever seen her face, that it had been the first thing he knew about her. She had been quiet for a moment, and then said she had carved it with something between defiance and despair, not knowing who might see it or when, just needing it to be there. He said it had worked. She said she supposed it had. The pecan trees were in full leaf along the creek. The cattle they had acquired since January, 23 head now, were visible as dark shapes against the grass to the north. The well was producing reliably. There was a second room in the cabin now, added in April, and the roof was fully repaired. The vegetable garden was running along the south wall with a confidence that suggested Belle's knowledge of such things was considerably more advanced than his own. He put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and they stood there for a while in the evening light. He said he had something he wanted to ask her about. She said that she had something she wanted to tell him. He said she could go first. She told him she was expecting a child. She said it with the directness she brought to most important things, looking up at him with those gray-brown eyes and a small, precise smile that contained a great deal of complicated emotion, very cleanly held. He felt something open in his chest so completely that he had to take a breath before he could say anything. Then he told her what he had been about to ask, which was whether she would consider them making the cabin a permanent home in the most deliberate sense, whether she would want to put down roots here that went further than practicality required, roots that were about choosing this place and this life as the thing they were building together. She said she thought a child constituted a fairly definitive answer to that question. He laughed, which she had come to understand was one of her particular pleasures, getting that genuine laugh out of him, because he was a man who laughed when something genuinely surprised him, and it was never performative. They went inside together, and the evening star came up above the limestone ridge to the west, and inside the cabin the lamp was yellow and warm. Their son arrived in February of 1884, a healthy, loud-voiced baby boy that Belle named James after her father, with Timothy's full and immediate agreement. James Harold Langston, they called him, the second name for the uncle who had held the line long enough for both of them to find their way to it. The birth was difficult, as frontier births frequently were, attended by Mrs. Halloran, who had turned out to also be a capable and calm midwife, and by the end of it Timothy had sat outside in the cold for 4 hours with his hands clasped and conducted what he thought was probably the most sincere conversation with God he had ever had. When Mrs. Halloran opened the door and told him he could come in, he went to Belle, and she looked exhausted and strong in equal measure, and she put the baby in his arms, and he stood there holding his son and thinking about Harold and about James Wallace and about the name carved into the fence post and about everything that had had to happen for this particular person to exist in his arms. He told Belle she was extraordinary. She said she had pushed a human being into the world after 4 hours of labor, and he could be more specific. He said she was the strongest and bravest person he had ever known, and that he loved her more than he had known it was possible to love anyone, and that he was going to spend the rest of his life making sure she never had to carve her name into anything just to be remembered. She looked at him for a moment, and the composure was entirely gone, just the real face underneath it that she let him see now, the one that was not performing at all. She said she loved him too. She said it simply, without ornamentation, in the voice she used for things that were entirely true. The years that followed built themselves layer by layer over the foundation they had established. The cattle herd grew to 60 head by 1885, and then to 80 by 1887. Timothy took on 2 hired hands, one of them a young man named Archero Medina, whose family had been in the region since long before Anglo settlement, and who had specific knowledge of the land and water patterns that proved invaluable. Belle's kitchen garden expanded into a genuine food production operation, and she began trading produce with 3 other families in the county on a regular basis. The cowhound situation evolved slowly, and in the direction Timothy had suspected it would when the legal structure holding it together was loosened. 2 of the smaller operations that had been most directly damaged by the water rights seizure filed their own legal claims through 1884 and 1885, and both succeeded. The financial pressure of multiple legal defeats, combined with declining cattle prices that hit large operations hardest, led Calhoun to sell his general store in 1886 and reduce his cattle operation significantly. He remained in the county but as a diminished figure, and the texture of daily life in Redemption Creek shifted noticeably in the years following the ruling. Sheriff Pickett's replacement, a straight-backed man named Harlan who had worked as a deputy in another county for 5 years, brought a different quality of law enforcement to the town. He was not perfect, nobody in that era and that landscape was, but he was genuinely trying, and the difference was felt. Belle never fully forgave the county for what it had permitted to happen to her father. Timothy understood that and did not ask her to. What she did, instead of forgiveness, was channel the energy that might have gone into bitterness into building something that was real and lasting and entirely hers, which he thought was a more honest resolution than forgiveness would have been in any case. She started a small school session on Saturday mornings in 1885, teaching reading and arithmetic to the children of farm and ranch families whose parents could not afford the regular school fees during the winter terms. She did it in their expanded cabin, with a blackboard Timothy built and mounted on the wall of the new second room, and she did it with the same directness and high expectation she brought to everything. The children, who generally found her initially intimidating and subsequently excellent, made genuine progress, and several of their parents began leaving small gifts of food and goods as an unofficial payment that Belle accepted with a gracefulness that showed she understood the gesture. Timothy watched her teach sometimes from the doorway when he came in from morning chores, and he thought about the carving in the fence post and about her father's belief that truth left in writing was harder to destroy than truth held only in memory. Belle had found her own version of that principle. She was leaving her mark in the people she taught, in the reading and the arithmetic and the habit of thinking carefully, and that would outlast anything that could be carved into cedar or written in a legal document. In the autumn of 1886, she told him she was expecting again. This one came easier, a girl they named Ruth, who arrived in May of 1887 with dark hair and a look of intense consideration that appeared very early and never quite left her face. James was 3 years old by then and regarded his sister with a solemn 2-week assessment before deciding she was acceptable, a decision he communicated by bringing her a small stone he considered particularly fine and placing it next to her in the cradle. Timothy and Belle lay in bed that night with the children sleeping and the spring wind moving outside, and he told her that he had thought, when he rode into Redemption Creek in October of 1882, that he was coming to deal with a piece of property. He said that was a significant underestimation of what the trip would involve. She said it was a considerable underestimation of what the trip would involve. He said he was grateful for every complicated, dangerous, legally intricate part of it. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said she was grateful too. Not for what had happened to her father. That grief had its permanent place, and she carried it honestly. But for what had grown out of the soil of everything that had been taken, the 40 acres and the creek and the husband and the children and the Saturday school, and the slow particular pleasure of a life that was genuinely hers. She said she thought her father would have liked Timothy. She said it carefully, because talking about James Wallace always cost her something, but she said it. He said he thought Harold would have liked Belle. He said Harold had understood something about what kind of person she was, even from a distance, which was why he had left the land the way he did. She said she believed that. He held her hand in the dark, and they lay listening to the spring wind and the small sounds of the children sleeping, and eventually to each other's breathing evening out into sleep. On a morning in the spring of 1888, Timothy was repairing the old cedar fence post at the southwest corner of the property, which had finally deteriorated past the point of reasonable service. He dug it out carefully, and before he set the new post, he held the old one in both hands and looked at the name carved into it one final time. Belle Wallace, deep enough that you could feel the letters in the dark. Belle came out from the cabin with coffee, James running ahead of her and Ruth on her hip, and she stopped when she saw what he was holding. She set Ruth down, who immediately sat in the dirt with great satisfaction, and she came and stood beside him. He said he was not sure what to do with the post. She took it from him and looked at it for a long moment. She said she wanted to keep it. She said they should put it in the barn. He said that was exactly right. She handed it back to him and picked up Ruth and called to James, who had already made his way to the fence line and was examining something in the grass with the intense interest of a 4-year-old boy who had discovered an insect. She carried Ruth back toward the cabin, and James came pelting after her, and Timothy stood in the morning light with the old cedar post in his hands and the name carved into it, Belle Wallace, and he felt the full weight of everything that name had meant and what it had led to. The dark past, and the forced choices and the betrayal of everything that should have protected her. And then the slow, hard-won building of something real and true on the other side of all of it. He carried the post into the barn and laid it across 2 beams in the loft where it would keep. Then he sank the new post and strung the wire and went inside for breakfast. Belle was at the stove and James was at the table and Ruth was in her basket, and the coffee was hot, and the morning light was coming in through the east window in the long golden way it had in spring. And Timothy Langston stood in the doorway of the cabin on the 40 acres that were entirely, lastingly, beautifully home, and understood that the life you end up with is not always the one you intended and is sometimes. If you have been paying attention and courageous enough and lucky enough in the particular way that luck requires courage to land correctly, so much larger and more real than anything you would have planned for yourself. Belle looked up from the stove and found him standing there and gave him the look she had, the one that was not the composed public face and not even the private vulnerable face, but the third one underneath both of those. The one that was simply her regarding him with full knowledge and full choosing. He went in and sat down, and James immediately told him at considerable length about the insect he had discovered at the fence line, which appeared to be either a beetle or a very interesting kind of small rock, the jury being still out. Belle put a plate in front of him, and their hands touched briefly as she did. Ruth made a small decisive sound from her basket that suggested she had an opinion on the beetle question. Outside, the spring wind moved through the pecan trees along the creek, the same trees that had stood there when Belle had walked that bank alone, and when Timothy had first come to this land not knowing what he was walking toward. The cattle were in the north pasture. The garden was coming up. The new fence post stood bright and solid at the southwest corner. And in the barn loft, in the cool, dry dark, the old cedar post lay across its beams, her name cut deep into it, permanent and deliberate and true. Belle Wallace. The name she had left on the land when everything else was being taken. The name that had been there waiting for him before he ever saw her face. It would stay there as long as the wood held, which turned out to be a very long time indeed. They had one more child, a second boy named Thomas, who arrived in 1890 with red hair that bewildered everyone, and with a disposition so cheerful that it seemed to reset the temperature of any room he entered. James and Ruth received him with the senior authority of experienced siblings, and the three of them together filled the expanded cabin with a noise level that Timothy privately and contentedly regarded as the best possible evidence that something had been built on this land that was worth the building. Belle's Saturday school continued and grew. By 1891, she had 8 regular students, and had formally proposed to the county school board that a second session be added on Wednesday afternoons, a proposal she made with such thorough documentation and obvious evidence of educational outcomes that the board approved it without extensive debate, partly because she was right, and partly because the quality of her preparation made disagreement feel like a larger effort than it was worth. She was a formidable person in any room she entered. Timothy had always known this, and now the wider county was learning it, the particular quality of her attention and her refusal to be managed or dismissed, which had once been the survival tools of a woman in an impossible situation, and were now the professional tools of a woman building something permanent. Calhoun died in 1891, quietly, of a stroke, in the house that had become too large for his diminished circumstances. There were no particular feelings attached to the news in the Langston household. Belle was quiet for a day, inward-looking, processing something that was not grief and not satisfaction, but perhaps the particular texture of a long-standing weight finally being set down. Then she was herself again, and they did not speak of it further. Alan Reeves sent a letter that year with a note of congratulation on the outcome of all proceedings and a brief inquiry after the family's health. Belle wrote back a long, detailed letter about the children and the ranch and the school and the state of the Water Creek, and she signed it Belle Langston, which she had been signing for 8 years, and then she paused, and below her name she wrote, in small letters, formerly Belle Wallace. She showed it to Timothy before she sealed it. He said that was exactly right. She said she thought it mattered to keep both. That the name she had now was the name she had chosen and built into and loved, but that the name she had carved into the fence post, alone and afraid and refusing to disappear, was also the name she was. They were not in conflict. They were the same woman at different points on the same road, and the road was real, and she had walked every inch of it with full knowledge. He said she should be a writer as well as a teacher. She said she had enough occupations. He said she probably had enough occupations for 3 people, and that he was glad she had chosen him as a component of her situation. She said she had chosen him quite carefully, and that she stood by the choice. He said the feeling was entirely mutual. Spring came again and summer after it, and the years moved forward with the particular grace of time that is fully inhabited, that is lived in rather than endured. The children grew in the way of children, with astonishing speed, and with the specific personalities they arrived with, James the serious and observant one, Ruth the deliberate and intelligent one, Thomas the incandescent one who laughed at everything including himself. They grew up knowing this land from birth, the pecan trees and the limestone creek, and the 40 acres that had become considerably more than 40 acres, as Timothy and Belle added adjacent parcels when they became available over the years. They grew up knowing, when they were old enough to understand it, the story of how their parents had come to be here. Belle told it factually and completely, the injustice and the loss and the grief and the fence post and the finding. She did not soften the parts that were hard. She believed in the kind of truth that was left in writing, in speaking, in the deliberate record of what actually happened, and she gave her children the whole story because she believed they needed to know that things could be very wrong and that people could fight them, and that the fighting was worth doing. James, at 10 years old, asked to see the fence post in the barn. Belle took him up the ladder herself and held the lantern while he ran his fingers over the letters. He asked why she had carved it. She said she had needed someone to find it. She said that sometimes you cannot speak aloud and you cannot be seen, but you can leave something in a place where the right person might find it. James thought about this for a while. Then he said the right person found it. Belle said yes, he did. They climbed down from the loft and went back to the cabin, where Timothy was at the table with Thomas on his knee and Ruth reading at the window. And the fire was burning and the lamp was yellow, and the night outside was full of the sounds of Texas in the spring, coyotes and wind and the creek running over limestone, the same sounds that had been there before any of them and would be there after, carrying forward through time with the patient indifference of the land itself, which does not remember or forget but only continues, and in continuing holds everything that has happened on it, every name carved into every post, every choice made in the face of fear, every love that grew in the particular soil of this place, lasting and real and endlessly, stubbornly alive.